Hello, we are back for episode 9. This is season 2 of Arab Amp, Folktales, and we're calling in this month from Glendale, California, Los Angeles, California. This month is really exciting. We have writer, translator, and performer Randa Jarrar, who is a queer Palestinian artist based out of the LA area. And we also have our community spotlight with Sarah Williams. We are here today at the Feminist Center for Creative Work in Glendale, California. So tune in for a very exciting episode. We'll kick this off for April 2023. Sitting here today with Sarah Williams. Sarah, it's really nice to have this conversation with you. Thanks for meeting with us. And we're sitting here in Glendale, California at the Feminist Center for Creative Work. Wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your work, your projects, the collective, and your perspective of the why and the how of this organization. So maybe the first question is, what is the history of this institution?
Sure.
And why and how you set up this organization?
Yeah, okay. So I'm Sarah Williams. I'm one of the co-founders and the current executive director of Feminist Center for Creative Work. I would say we had a very kind of organic start to the organization. My co-founders and I went and saw this exhibition, doing it in public, which was part of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time programming. They, in 2012, were doing this big program around all kind of LA's specific art histories and really focusing on different topics. And so at Otis, they did this exhibition on the historic women's building, which was in downtown Los Angeles. And, you know, studying art history, I'd learned a little bit about it, but it was always treated really as like kind of a blip of history that happened in the 70s. This was not particularly relevant today. And just being in that space and seeing really 20 years of depthful history, all of this programming, all of this design work, it was incredibly inspiring. And we really, talking amongst ourselves, were like, where does this intersection of feminism and art making creative practice exist today in Los Angeles? And really in that time period, we were not finding it, we were not seeing it in a way that felt meaningful to us. And so we slowly started to organize around that idea and just kind of ask people to join in conversation and see what like kind of versions of that were interesting to them. We did this by hosting these kind of big dinners, and we hosted the first one in the desert in 2013 because one of our co-founders was living out there at the time. We invited everyone we know that we thought would be interested in this. I think we expected, 20, 25 people to show up. 60 people came, stayed the night. It was like so fun and gave this like very exciting, catalyzing energy to the project. We did the next one about a year later in the kind of shadow of the historic women's building in downtown LA. There's this big park there, and 100 people came to that one. And it just, from there, it sort of felt like this like ball was rolling. It was mobilizing. So we did some programming. We're kind of talking through ideas. We entered into this period that we called the year-long laboratory, where we looked at kind of the history of this type of organizing in spaces, communities, and what that was going to mean to us. Economies, how do you sustain something like this? And then space, kind of what is the physical manifestation of this kind of work in Los Angeles? We were very lucky to receive a social practice grant in 2015 that let us put kind of really like first, last, it was not a good financial decision. It was first, last, and like maybe a deposit on the space, and moved in, and we really built kind of our community out from there. And it was a very grassroots community supported organization in the beginning. We wouldn't have been able to pay rent like the third month in without that. We were in this beautiful space. It was right along the LA River for 5 years. Incredibly active programming space. There was something happening like almost every night. It was a bit chaotic, but just like very energetic and fun. Slowly we evolved that kind of more properly into like there was more organized exhibitions and artist in residence projects. We had a library and a print studio and a beautiful garden, and a shared workspace. And it was really like this place, I think, where people could really come together, meet like-minded folks, and that felt really good. Obviously the pandemic impacted all of us in challenging ways, but in advance of that, we were planning on moving into a bigger space at the end of our 5-year lease, but then obviously March 2020, we shut everything down for a while and ended up giving up our space in like August of 2020. And so since then we've been working more remotely. We're in like one of our kind of studio office space that we've been in since then, but really still programming online and like deeply investing in our publishing practice during that time, which we can talk a little bit about later. But we have an imprint, Co-Conspirator Press, and then did a magazine, Salima. And really this year kind of starting to figure out the hybrid model of coming back to real space with real people in Los Angeles, not real people, but real space with people in real life in Los Angeles, not just online. Yeah.
Wow, what a story. It's like the roller coaster of starting something so exciting and impactful, having to ride through the pandemic and all the places, where are we now, really? Yeah. And I think you named beautifully the way that you all started, kind of the spark. Yeah. I'm wondering, in the development of the center, your publishing, all the other programs that we can talk about. Yeah. What do you feel your most exciting intervention is, or your most important intervention?
My favorite things to do, I guess, are like where I can answer that question from like a very personal perspective and not necessarily the organizational perspective, but I am really invested in working deeply with artists on issues that are important to them without as much pressure of like I think market forces and whatever that can exist in the art world, to give people time and space and material resource and like an opportunity to connect with people in making their work. And I think that's where kind of art and these ideas can have their most impact, like kind of in that kind of community context. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when people are well supported. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, working with the community is intentional. You're obviously Los Angeles city and area based. Yes. So thinking about maybe the opportunities to build community is something that you've said.
Yeah, because I think I hesitate to say like that the organization has like a clear and defined community, but I think there is an opportunity with coming to things, with programming, with ways you can engage with art at the space, that there's opportunity for people to build community with like people. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can you talk about some of the programs, or more about maybe the publishing praxis that you all have to try and do that?
Totally. So one of our big programs is our Artist in Residence program. And that's usually like a 3-month long, sometimes even more, engagement with an artist where we're really working from them deeply, sort of from start to finish, on conceptualizing, building out, funding a project, which often looks like an exhibition in the end. Sometimes it looks like a series of programs. Sometimes there's also a publication element to it. But I think that kind of speaks to like really liking to go deep, to like allow time for things to be presented to our audiences, for people to like gain interest and like show up to the next thing before it just feels like it's like over all of a sudden. And then Co-Conspirator Press is our print arm of the organization, and we publish, I can show some of the books on camera, but we've published about 12 titles now. They are mostly reso printed in-house, at least the first few editions are. We do, this is, I think, one of our like kind of material economic models that feels important to us too. We do a 40-60 split with the artist in perpetuity around sales of the books. And so we manage all of like kind of business side of like selling and wholesaling, all of that, but then continue to split proceeds with them ongoingly. And I can talk, decolonizing nonviolent communication is I can give a real specific example with this. This came out of a program that was taking place at the space probably in 2017 or so, 18, and it was very popular. It could only accommodate maybe 10, 12 people at a time, and it ran for a few weeks. And so there was really a desire for people to be able to engage with the content that we weren't really able to like meet with the programming. And so Minachi wrote this book, and this really launched Co-Conspirator Press and has been a big success for kind of everyone involved with it. It's been very popular and has let us then take that funding and invest it into the publication of other books. And we do some via open call and some that get connected to projects and programs that we were doing, like a textbook for the eco scene. We're reprinting this year. Sarita Doherty, who was one of our artists in residence, this is very much in line with her practice. And also there's like 10 other people who are interviewed in their own practice as part of this book. And I think that's just really kind of exhibits a way we like to work, that it, like, there's this networked approach to it. Yeah.
Definitely. Wow, it's great just speaking to you now, seeing kind of the, theory of change, how you all really do the work, what intention you put into those pieces around, you didn't use this word, but maybe I would, around community hub or a creative hub.
For sure, yes.
Where you can offer. That's great. Yeah, it's really incredible, and I think it's just so needed also. Making an intervention around capitalism, individualism, which separates us from community support, from resources, to be able to do something, imagine something, make something beyond.
And I think even complicating the role of like institution or organization, that it's not like a one directional, like these are our things and we give them to you, but like it's an opportunity for like a network. They're like a community based like approach to learning, to producing, to making work that's beyond what we can. Like I love hearing about when people are like, oh, I met through this and now we're doing this whole other thing that's like well outside of the organization by that point. But like it feels like those are the ripple effects that feel most kind of, those are very exciting and impactful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think also in the spirit of connecting, I wanted to ask you about, again, you've spoken about the local work and the local focus.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's connected to a larger framework.
Yes.
And awareness of feminism as a global issue.
Sure,
and all of us having multi-issue lives, which is intersectionality.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I would say so I guess to like just frame our mission for the on camera, we aim to nurture an ever evolving, intersectional, intergenerational, and joyful collaborative feminist praxis. And I think we're using media, publishing, art making to model these ways in which we'd like to work feminist creative work and live in this praxis. And so one of the ways I would say to like directly answer your question is really working deeply with artists and issues that directly impact them or that are important to them is one of the ways I'd say we kind of bridge these local global issues, and kind of bringing people in who are making work from their very specific kind of intersectional identity, and then sharing that with others who may relate to some of that, may relate to all of it, may not relate to much of it at all, but are like, I think, learning and being brought into like the opportunities for a more thorough feminist politics, I'll say, through those programs and projects. Yeah.
For folks watching this who might be asking the question on the difference in the intersection between feminism and queerness, do you have any kind of thoughts on gender, like a gender analysis and? Yeah,
I think they definitely come from intersecting theoretical frameworks for sure, or at least, in my experience of it. But it is one of the reasons we changed the name. I guess an important point, when we founded, we were Women's Center for Creative Work, and over time, kind of internally, externally, that just felt like not a good fit, not exactly what we were talking about. And so we really realigned in renaming it Feminist Center for Creative Work. It was never to kind of really align that with our politic around organizing, rather than like an identity marker that wasn't feeling true to a lot of people involved, and also just like isn't, obviously not all women are feminists and not all feminists are women. And so it was important to, I think, make that really publicly clear about who we were talking about and who was being invited into the organization. Pull in, when I'm talking about things like this, I usually pull in this Sarah Ahmed. I mean, I'm paraphrasing deeply, so even call it a quote isn't totally accurate, but I saw her speak at the William Grant Stills Art Center, and she talked about how feminist theory really taught her how to like analyze and like systemically sort of like break down like how things function, but that queer theory taught her this way to imagine kind of like how things could be different, like how to imagine a different way of being. And I do really also feel like that's super present in our work. The organization is run entirely by queer women at this point, and even though it's not maybe like deeply embedded in the mission explicitly, it's definitely like very present in our way of working and operating and how we do things, for sure.
You said something earlier about we can only really address our perspectives and the work that we're doing, right? And the
Yeah.
local community, basically, or our local perspective.
We really try to be, I think it's part of our mission that we really talk about being based in Los Angeles, because admittedly there's only 4 of us really working deeply on this project day to day, and we are all living here in LA. And so I think being both a necessity to engage in, obviously, like things that are happening beyond that, but also like a being very, I think, honest, I guess, in the framework of where your perspective is coming from is important too, in terms of like feminist analysis. Yeah,
I think that's so powerful and really intellectually honest to say, like, this is our position and these are the contributions that we're making, these are the interventions, and knowing also having an international and global perspective of, okay, we know that these things are not happening in a vacuum, they happen in a silo, and the point of community also is to not just interact and grow together, but also to be able to expand beyond our own context.
Totally. And we live in Los Angeles County where, more languages I think are spoken than anywhere in the world, and 1 in 36 people or whatever in the US live in LA County, something like that. But so it's like we have so much, there's so much like richness here to like pull from that's not even, it's barely a limiting, I think sometimes feels like barely a limiting perspective. We could go years and years with like what's here, like,
Absolutely.
honestly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think just in closing out and thinking about, we've talked about the work, your perspective, and the different programs. I'm really curious around creativity and what opportunities that kind of creates, again, for you, for the organization, and just the power, like why creative work?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think when we think about activism and art, I think it's like it's always a little sticky, I feel like, because I think the normal, or the standard sort of like rubric of activist efficacy is hard to apply, I think, sometimes to art. Like, I don't think we see it in the one-to-one in the same time scale. And so I am always hesitant to like treat it as if it's doing something like that. But I believe deeply, I think, speaking for myself, but that it is one of the few opportunities, creative work, art making, writing is like one of the few opportunities we have to like really get out, not even outside, but like imagine other ways of being besides this like super ingrained, to pull bell hooks, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy. Like, it is so pervasive in all of our systems right now, and I think it's becoming even more powerful that, like, I do think art making is one of those few places we really get to like make outside, like imagine ways of being outside of those systems, and that really gives you permission to like play in that space and be creative in that space. I don't know. That's something I am passionate, and offering space to do that, and community, an opportunity to build community to do that in is, I think is essential. It's like not, it's not the most urgent issue perhaps, but I do think it's important to, the world we want. A more liberated world.
Absolutely. Holistic, endless, like, abundant. Things. And joyful, as you said.
It has to be joyful. I think we have to like live in it too. Every day.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I was such it's so wonderful to be able to hear you talk more about the work and expand kind of on the ideas and praxis elements behind it. For folks who are watching, how do we support the work that you do, and how do we get involved? So you can check out our website, FCCWLA.org. You can find us on Instagram at Feminist Center for Creative Work. You can become a member. We do have over, I think, 650 supporting members if you're really interested in financially supporting the work. But just come, be a part of it. It's fun. Thank you so much.
The neighborhood got its first dose of Amar the summer of her 9th birthday, when she sat on the rooftop of her Alexandria apartment building for 10 days and waited for the moon to come down. She did it for her neighbor Mitwalli. He promised to be hers forever if she only brought him the moon. Mitwalli was 24 and had no idea that Amar would take his pledge to heart. The first night on the roof, Amar sat on a long chair with a rope in her hands. The people began to wonder, And when midnight came and she was still there, they informed the Bawab and asked him to go check on her. Too lazy to climb the 9 stories, he shouted up from his post at the front entrance of the building. "What's with you, Omar?" "I want the moon," she yelled. A collective sigh was broadcast from the audience that now gathered in the street. "The moon's expensive," the people yelled back at her. "It costs 10 nights, 10 whole wakeful nights, and you can't nod off, not even for a second." Omar stayed up the 10 whole nights, and the moon was descending. Everyone agrees that it was. Omar developed dark crescents under her eyes, and her hair was dreading. On the 10th night, the moon vanished, but the people never agreed on how. Some said that Omar nodded off, and the moon shot back up into the vastness of sky. So high no one could see it anymore. Omar said she only fell asleep for an instant, and when she opened her eyes, the moon was gone, and she insisted that Zainab, the evil neighbor girl who had had her eye on Mitwalli for weeks, filched the moon during that short instant of sleep. How else could one explain what happened next? Mitwalli fell in love with Zainab, and 20 years later, they lived in a flat on San Stefano Street with 6 kids. Mitwalli was Zainab's forever, and Omar was a stranger. It made a small sidebar in all the papers, Al-Ahram, Al-Akhbar, and even Al-Sharq Al-Awsat. That was how Hilal knew of Omar. He'd read the story in Al-Ahram 2 decades before. Hilal himself had appeared in the paper twice, the first time for placing number 1 nationwide in the secondary school final exams, and the second for turning down the president's offer of sending him to London for free medical training as a cardiologist. Hilal wrote to the president, "Sir, I have no interest in hearts or in how to mend them. Can you send me to Houston?" You see, Hilal had been trying to figure out a way to get to the moon since he was 4 years old. His father, a fisherman in Alexandria's East Quay, once caught Hilal dangling his feet outside the boat and casting a net over the moon's reflection. Much later, Hilal heard that men could walk on the moon's surface, and when he looked into it, he took the tram to the American embassy, the Russian embassy, and the visa office. He realized that jumping to the moon would be more realistic than obtaining a visa and traveling to Houston for astronaut training. Here's what the president had to say about NASA instruction. "Son, our country has no interest in reaching the moon. However, we do need a bright young man like you in our nuclear weapons development facility." You might wonder why Omar's parents let their child sit on the roof for 10 nights in a row, and for a boy. You might think Egyptian parents don't let their little girls get away with things like that, and you'd be right. But Omar's parents were different. They were actors in the Théâtre de l'Alexandrie. Her mother was Safia, and her father was Farid Hafiz. You may have heard of their summertime performances at the Corniche Theatre, the pink, hieroglyphed, open-air venue resembling a shell. Sophia and Farid performed musical comedies on that stage, their only child watching from behind the velvet curtain every night. When she was 5, she told them she wanted to dance. But she needed credibility as a performer, so they enrolled her at the Conservatoire for ballet lessons. By her 13th birthday, she was one of Egypt's top ballerinas, the Russian allied government sending her to St. Petersburg for exclusive performances. When Omar was 15, her parents were run over by a van in St. Petersburg as they were crossing the street to watch her dance at a theater. The van's passengers, sticking their heads out of the window and peering into monoculars, distracted the heavy-footed driver. Looking up into the sky, he saw the cause of their excitement, a lunar eclipse. Her parents were killed instantly. Now, if she hadn't been a ballerina, she wouldn't have gone to St. Petersburg. If she hadn't gone to St. Petersburg, her parents would never have crossed that cursed street. If her performance had been on a different night, the driver would not have been distracted. If many years ago, Dulles hadn't thought Nasser was bluffing, Egypt would never have found an ally in Russia, and her performance may have been held in Washington, where van drivers rarely hold romantic sentiments about the moon or any other heavenly object. Ever heard of anyone dying of a split? She hadn't, and so immediately began working as a tightrope walker for the Cirque de la Lune, a French circus based in Alexandria. Their tent was attached to the St. Mark's School for Boys. You could see her walking the big brown bears in the early mornings, berating them for their laziness. They always moved a bit faster for her. She wore her tightrope walking suit, a shiny green leotard, and a lime green tutu speckled with tiny silver stars. Her tights were sheer gray, her feet bound in pink ballet slippers. On leashes, she would walk all 9 bears in circles around the circus courtyard, on point. The first time Hillel glimpsed Qamar, he was riding the dirty street tram and staring out the broken window. He caught the same tram to the nuclear development plant downtown, and one morning he saw her leading the bears. To him, she resembled the sun of an entire cosmos. He felt as though his spirit was spilling out of the speeding tram's window, and for weeks tried to work up the courage to get off at the St. Mark's station and visit her. He didn't realize then that she was the 9-year-old featured in the newspaper. Later, Hillel rummaged through his drawer for his journal and found the yellowed paper with the old headline, "Girl Makes Moon Disappear." He decided to use part of his weekly salary to go to the Cirque de la Lune and see Amar's high-wire act in person. Amar had discovered 4 to 8 hours after her parents' death that she must marry Amar, a family friend, who would take over responsibility for her. This final blow had sickened her so much that she decided to present her show without a safety net. At first, this made the circus ringleader Laurent's stomach churn, but eventually it brought the show good publicity, so he let her do it. She walked the wire on point, performing flips and splits, pliés and twirls, all the while hoping to fall and break her neck. She never did. Suspecting it would take riskier moves for her death wish to come true, she incorporated a pigeon, a vulture, and a cat, a tiger, into her act. Hillel watched her from the front row, his heart drumming like a tattered tabla. After the show, he followed her home. She knew he was trailing her, so she walked through strangers' courtyards, under banana trees and their huge leaves, in and out of buildings, and hid behind jasmine trellis walls, her heart beating hard until she lost him. Once home, she sat out in the balcony and soaked her bloodied toes in ice water. The residents, over 70 years old, had balconies each covered by a mashrabeya. From her balcony, she could see Cleopatra Beach and a broken moon in the water, the obelisk in the middle of the nearby square, a leftover piece of history. Archaeologists had observed it the previous summer and said the ancients placed it strategically so that it lined up with a constellation, like a finger pointing to the heavens. Amar's bed was on the balcony. She moved there after her parents died. She began sleeping in a black nightgown, mourning them in her dreams. Hillel believed she had the courage he lacked. That was why he thought he loved her. He would never be able to walk on the moon, but he formulated a plan. The president let him dabble with anything, as long as it didn't involve explosions. And that was fine with Hillel. His rocket didn't need to explode. On the night of the Moulid, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, Amar, depressed with only a few weeks of freedom remaining before her wedding, went out to join the festivities. That night, all of Alexandria was a circus. There were colorful celebrations on every major street. Sufi dancers in white robes swirled around in red and white calligraphy-covered tents, 12 dancers in all, weaving around themselves and in a circle, perfectly synchronized like the planets. Amar remembered one Moulid in particular. Her father took her to the pastry shop where they bought Arusat al-Moulid, the traditional doll of the Moulid. The doll was made entirely of bright pink sugar, and Amar used to think that it looked like a ballerina. She had refused to eat her doll and kept it on her bookshelf. The next morning, she was horrified to find only part of the doll's dress left, and even that was covered in small black ants, busily chewing at its pretty pink skin. Amar decided not to buy a Moulid doll this year. She visited the many tents and walked back and forth on the Corniche, finally stopping at the Eastern Harbor. That was where Hillel saw her. He almost didn't recognize her. She was wearing jeans, dirty sneakers, and 2 uneven braids that were partially covered by a deep blue kerchief. He stood next to her and said that he used to fish the face of the moon. Then he asked if she'd been the 9-year-old girl from the newspapers. "Oh, that bitch Zainab," she said, and he got to hear the part of the story the newspapers didn't print. They walked along the ocean road, Amar half wishing Amar would see her with Hillel, assume she was a slut, and break off the engagement. Arriving at her building, they stood in front of the cafe at the bottom floor. Several older men sat out front, smoking honeyed tobacco out of old shishas and swapping stories. Hillel pointed at a small black and white TV in the corner. When Amar turned to the flickering screen, she saw Michael Jackson on stage wearing shiny gloves and doing the moonwalk. "Kull sana wa inti tayyiba," he said. "Merry Moulid." He gave her a pink Moulid doll and she accepted it, figuring her aunt's story would be too complicated to tell. Amar went home, sat on the balcony, and ate the pink sugar doll. She began with the doll's feet, then the legs, then devoured the torso in less than 30 seconds. The head took a little longer. Too full to eat the arms, Amar flung them onto her nightstand and almost passed out into a sugar coma. She got up and took all her clothes off, then looked out of the mashrabeya and onto the street, where Hillel stood by the obelisk. She wondered if he could see her and reached over to her black nightgown, pausing for a moment before slipping it on. Then she tumbled into bed and fell asleep at once. Hillel did see her, the brown skin behind the wooden lattice partition. The moon shone its borrowed light through the screen and cast intricate shadows across her breasts, her belly, her legs. He felt as though he'd stolen something sweet, and after she disappeared, he walked home, feet bouncing off the asphalt. The next day, the doll's arms, intact, shone pink. Not a single ant in sight. Hillel began attending the Cirque de la Lune often enough to get in free. He was unaware that Amar's wedding day was fast approaching, that this was the reason she now used a unicycle with 2 high wires in her act, jumping from one to the other. She still refused a safety net. One evening after the show, Hillel asked if she'd like to go to the Muntazah, the public park at the northeast end of Alexandria that used to be King Fairouz's summer palace. Popular romantic hangout. "So you can tell me about the deer that used to wander around there, and we can listen to how nice the waves crash, and you'll try to kiss me?" "Oh, no," she said nervously in one breath. "What would you rather do?" Hillel said, looking over at an old man fanning corn over coals on a straw crate. "I almost broke my neck," she said, "and I'm still in ballet slippers. I'll give you one guess." "You want to go home and go to sleep," he said. "I understand. Good night." He flagged down an orange and black taxi. Amar made a loud buzzer sound. "Wrong. You guessed wrong. I want ice cream. I want 2 scoops on a cone." He laughed and said something about ballerinas not being allowed to eat more than 3 grapes a day. "That's why I quit," she lied. The taxi took them to Sultana Sweets. Hillel ordered 1 scoop of vanilla on a cone, and Amar said the scoop looked like the night's full moon. They sat on the bridge. He stuck his tongue out to lick the full moon, but it fell off the cone and onto the ground. "Very coordinated," she said. "I'd like to see you walk the rope sometime." The bridge stretched over Desert Highway 1, the 3rd most fatal motorway in the country. They watched the cars go by, trucks brushing the soles of their shoes. I have a rocket, he told her. I built it myself. Want to go for a ride with me? Very funny, she said. He said he was serious, that he wanted to go to the moon with her, that she had made the mistake when she was 9 of waiting for it to come to her. The moon is at 325 San Stefano Street. Mitwelli's got it. I'm getting married next week. Did you know that? She said this without looking up from her ice cream cone. The cars zoomed by beneath them, and Hillel wanted to jump to make a pretty design on the asphalt below. There's no reason why two people need to know each other's every flaw before they get married, she said in between licks. No mathematical law or theorem for falling in love. It isn't like the distance to the moon. It's much less than that, and more doable. The din of passing traffic made it difficult for him to hear her clearly. Are you saying you love me? He said. She hit her forehead with the palm of her hand. I'm saying I'm getting married next week. You're invited. The day of the wedding, Hillel completed his rocket and hauled it out to the square by Amar's house. It was Ramadan and people were breaking their fasts indoors, so virtually no one saw him. If they did, they rushed home and told their wives, "Tzadda'i you sit. Can you believe it, woman? I just saw a white rocket on the back of a truck. I'm that damn hungry." The wedding was at home. Her uncles and aunts, cousins and grandparents, and future in-laws arrived early. They danced and sang and ate, then waited for the Ma'zoon to come and officially marry her to Omar, the man they had chosen. Omar looked at Omar, who stared hungrily at her upon his arrival. She tried to crack a smile. His eyes bored into hers and her arms went numb. Omar realized then that this man made her feel like a Moulid doll, as if there were millions of ants chewing her body from the inside out. Wanting some air, she reached over to the window and saw Hillel standing next to the obelisk. Then, beside it, another obelisk. She yelled, "Oh my God, the man wasn't kidding." "Who? What man?" Omar said. He panicked at the mention of another man. She stood up and walked toward the balcony. She opened the window. She climbed over the railings. Her family stopped eating and all eyes were fixed on her as she jumped down to the yellow clotheslines. Hillel saw her then, and a bright smile stretched across his face like jet stream in a clear sky. He started the rocket engine. She walked the line all the way to the end and jumped onto a lower clothesline. The people in the street looked up at her and heaved a collective, "Here she goes again!" They informed the Baweb, but he was too afraid to climb any clotheslines, so he yelled from his post at the front of the building, "What's with you, Omar?" "I want the moon," she yelled back. The people began to say something, but Omar did a backflip onto another line, dotted with a fat woman's underwear, and told them, "And I don't need your advice this time." The end.